It was a nice summer day. My 5-year-old son James was outside playing in the backyard. James has always been a quiet boy. He plays by himself mostly. He never had many friends, but he always had a wild imagination. I was in the kitchen feeding our dog Fido when I heard what sounded like James talking to someone in the backyard. I'm not sure who it was he could be talking to. Could he have finally made a friend? Being a single mom, it's hard for me to always keep an eye on my son, so I decided to go outside and check on him. When I went into the backyard, I was a bit confused because James was the only person there. Was he talking to himself? I could have sworn I heard another voice. "James, it's time to come inside," I called out to him. He came inside and sat down at the kitchen table. It was about lunchtime, so I decided to make him a turkey sandwich. "James, who were you talking to out there?" I asked. James looked up for a moment. "I was playing with my new friend," he said, smiling. I poured him some milk and continued to pry, as any good mother would do. "Does your friend have a name? Why didn't you ask him to have lunch with us?" I asked. James stared at me for a moment before replying. "His name is Laughing Jack." I was a bit taken back by what he had said. "Oh, that's a strange name. What does your friend look like?" I asked, a bit confused. "He's a clown. He has long hair and a big swirly cone nose. He got long arms and baggy pants with stripy socks, and he always smiles." I realized my son was talking about an imaginary friend. I suppose it's normal for kids his age to have imaginary friends, especially when he has no real kids to play with. It's probably just a phase. The rest of the day went by as usual, and it was starting to get late, so I put James to bed. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and made sure to turn on his nightlight before I closed the door. I was pretty tired myself, so I decided to go to bed not long after. I had an awful nightmare. It was dark. I was in some kind of rundown amusement park. I was scared, running through an endless field of empty tents, broken down rides, abandoned game huts. The whole place had a horrible look to it. Everything was black and white. The prizes, stuffed animals, all hung from nooses in game huts, all with sick grins stitched to their faces. It felt like the whole park was looking at me, even though there wasn't another living thing in sight. Then I suddenly began to hear music play. The sounds of Pop Goes the Weasel began being played on a squeeze box, echoed through the park. It was hypnotizing. I followed its tune to a circus tent, almost in a trance, unable to stop my legs from moving forward. It was pitch black. The only light came from a single spotlight, shining in the middle of the big top. As I walked towards the light, the music slowed down, and I found myself singing along, unable to stop. All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought it was all in fun. The music stopped right before its climax, and suddenly the light shot on. The intensity of the lights was practically blinding. All I could see was a small, dark silhouette shuffle towards me. Then there were dozens of them, all coming toward me. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen. All I could do was watch as these haunting figures drew nearer. As they got closer, I could see they were all children. As I looked at each one, I noticed that they were all horribly disfigured and mutilated. Some had cuts all over their bodies. Others were severely burnt, and others were missing limbs, even eyes. The children enveloped me, clawing at my flesh, dragging me to the ground and tearing me inside. As the children tore me apart and I faded away, all I could hear was laughter. Horrible, awful, evil laughter. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat. After taking a few deep breaths, I looked over and saw that a few of James's action figures were positioned facing me on top of my nightstand. I sighed. James had probably woken up early and put these here. I gathered up the toys and made my way to James's room. However, when I opened the door, James was sound asleep. I just shrugged and placed the toys back in his toy box and headed out to the living room. A little while later, James woke up and I made him breakfast. He was quiet and seemed a bit groggy. Perhaps he didn't sleep well either. I decided to ask him about the toys. James, honey, did you put the toys in Mommy's room this morning? His eyes shot up at me for a moment, then quickly glanced back at his cereal. Laughing Jack did it. I rolled my eyes in response. Well, you tell Laughing Jack to keep the toys in your room. James nodded and finished his breakfast up. Then he decided to go and play in the backyard. I went to relax in the living room, and I must have dozed off because I woke up a couple hours later. Crap, I need to check on James. I was a bit worried. It had been over 2 hours, and I haven't checked on him. I stepped out into the backyard, but James wasn't there anymore. I was getting nervous, so I called out to him. James, where are you? Just then, I heard a giggle come from the front yard. I rushed through the gate around to the front of the house. James was sitting on the sidewalk. I breathed a sigh of relief and walked over to him. James, how many times have I told you to stay in the back? James, what are you eating? James looked up to me, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a handful of hard candies in all colors. This made me very nervous. James, who gave you the candy? James just stared at me, not speaking. James, please tell Mommy where you got the candy. James hung his head down and said, Laughing Jack gave it to me. My heart sunk. I kneeled down to look him in the eye. James, I have had enough of this damn Laughing Jack thing. He is not real. Now, this is a very serious situation, and I need to know who gave you the candy. I could see my son's eyes tear up. But, Mama, Laughing Jack did give me the candy. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. James had never lied to me, but what he's telling me is impossible. I made him spit out the candy and throw the rest away. James appears to be fine. Maybe I'm just overreacting. After all, he could have gotten it from Tom and Linda next door or Mr. Walker down the street. Either way, I'm going to have to keep a closer eye on James. That night, I put James to bed as usual and decided to go to bed early myself. Suddenly, I woke up to a loud bang coming from the kitchen. I sprung out of bed and hurried downstairs. When I got to the kitchen, I was horrified. Everything on the counters had been thrown to the floor, and our dog Fido hung dead from the light fixture. His stomach was cut open and stuffed with candy, the same type that James was eating earlier that day. My shock was quickly broken by the sharp screams coming from James's room, followed by the loud crashes. I quickly grabbed a knife from the drawer and moved up the stairs with a speed that only a mother whose child was in danger could have. I burst through the door and flicked on the lights. Everything in the room was knocked over and tossed on the floor. My poor son in his bed, crying and shaking in fear, a pool of urine staining the sheets. I scooped up my child and ran out of the house and went next door to Tom and Linda's house. Luckily, they were still awake. They let me use their phone and I called the police. It didn't take long for them to arrive and I explained what happened. They looked at me as if I was crazy. They searched the house, but all they found was a dead dog and 2 trashed rooms. The officer told me that someone had probably gotten into the house and done this right before making a quick escape when they heard me coming up the stairs. I knew it wasn't true. All the doors were locked and none of the windows were open. Whatever was in my house didn't come from outside. The next day, James stayed inside. I didn't want him to leave my sight. I went into the garage and found his old baby monitor and set it up in his room. If anything comes into his room tonight, I was going to be able to hear it. I went to my kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the drawer and put it on my nightstand. Imaginary friend or not, I'm not letting anything hurt my little boy. Soon enough, night came. I put James to bed. He was afraid, but I promised him that I wasn't going to let anything happen to him. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and turned on the nightlight. Before closing the door, I whispered to him, "Good night, James. I love you." I tried to stay up as long as I could, but after a few hours, I felt myself drifting off. My baby would be safe for the night, and I needed to sleep. Just as I laid my head on the pillow, I heard a soft noise coming from the baby monitor. At first, it sounded like interference, like the kind a radio would make. Then it turned into a soft moan. Was James asleep? Then I heard it, the laugh from my nightmare, that horrible laugh. I sprang up from my bed and grabbed the knife from under the pillow. I rushed over to James's room and creaked the door open. I tried the light switch, but it wouldn't come on. I took a step in, and I could feel a warm, thick liquid on my feet. Suddenly, James's nightlight came on, and I could see the absolute horror laid out in front of me. James's body was nailed up to the wall, the nails piercing through his hands and feet. His chest was cut wide open and his organs hung down to the floor. His eyes and tongue had been removed, along with most of his teeth. I was disgusted. I could hardly believe this was my baby boy. Then I heard it again, that soft, desperate moan. James was still alive. My baby, my poor baby, in so much pain, barely clinging to life. I ran across the room and vomited on the floor, but my sickness was interrupted by a horrible cackle coming from behind me. I spun around while still wiping bile from my mouth. Then, out of the shadows emerged the fiend responsible for all this horror. Laughing Jack. His ghost white skin and matted black hair hung down to his shoulders. He had piercing white eyes surrounded by dark black rings. His twisted smile revealed a row of sharp, jagged teeth, and his skin didn't look like skin at all. It almost looked like rubber or plastic. He wore a patchy black and white clown outfit with striped sleeves and socks. His body itself was grotesque, his long arms hanging down past his waist, and the way he was poised made him look almost boneless, like a rag doll. He let out that sickening laugh as if to let me know he was pleased with my reaction to his work. He then turned around slowly in front of James and began to laugh even more at the horrific sight he had laid out. That was enough to shake me from my terror. I snapped, "Get away from him, you bastard!" I rushed at the monster, raising the knife above my head, and stabbed down at him. But as soon as the knife touched him, he disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. The knife passed right through and pierced James' beating heart, splashing warm blood on my face. "No! What have I done? My baby! I killed my baby!" I immediately fell to my knees, and I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. "My boy! My sweet baby boy! I promised Mommy would protect you, but I failed. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry. Police soon arrived and found me in front of my son, still wielding the knife, covered in my baby's blood. The trial was short. Insanity. I was placed in the Pretorius House for the Criminally Insane, where I have been for the past 2 months. It's not so bad here. The only reason I'm awake now is because someone is playing Pop Goes the Weasel outside my window. I'll talk to the orderlies about it in the morning. The internet legend of Laughing Jack first appeared on a popular social community for artists, DeviantArt, by user Snuffbomb on March 2nd, 2013. Because the story of Laughing Jack was so successful online, the author posted an origin story in December of 2013. This story revealed Laughing Jack's first playmate was a poor young boy named Isaac in Victorian England, who received a laughing Jack-in-the-Box for Christmas. According to this story, Jack began as a good-natured toy to keep lonely children company, although he does not allow Isaac to show him to his parents. Because his parents can't see Laughing Jack, Isaac is blamed and often punished for their playtime escapades, which Jack takes too far sometimes. Isaac is eventually sent to a boarding school as a result, leaving Jack to grow disillusioned and hollow. Isaac finally returns home as a grown man, scarred from his traumatic treatment at school, and is now a violent, brutal man. When Laughing Jack witnesses old friends viciously assault and murder many people, disposing of their bodies in creative ways, he becomes fascinated by it and eventually delighted by what he perceives as Isaac's new game, which explains where the sadistic taste for murdering children came from. As the Laughing Jack stories became more popular for people looking for a good scare, his story evolved, and soon the killer clown, just like Slender Man, inspired a horrific crime. On July 23, 2015, a 12-year-old girl in Elkhart, Indiana, stabbed and killed her stepmother, then set their apartment on fire, blaming none other than Laughing Jack. That evening, police were dispatched to the small Elkhart, Indiana apartment where they encountered the horrific scene. When they later questioned the girl, identified only as JT because of her age, she told police that Laughing Jack made her stab her mother. It was also discovered that earlier that evening, she had texted a friend she was planning on running away with, saying things like, "Take it anymore," and "about to snap." According to the girl's father, Edwin Torres, during dinner that evening, she was acting very strange, displaying a big grin showing all of her teeth. She told her parents that she was completely fine, but then took on a strange posture before running back to her room. Later, Edwin smelled smoke and ran to his daughter's room, where he saw several small fires in her closet. When he rushed in to put out the fires, he heard his wife scream, "JT has a knife!" JT's stepmother, Maria Torres, began banging on her half-sister's door, trying to wake her. When she finally awoke, she found her mother soaked in blood, saying, I'm dying, call the police." Maria had been fatally stabbed multiple times in her face and torso. Her father finally made it outside and yelled to the rest of the family to get away from the house. Looking up, he said he saw JT standing by the apartment door, and when he looked into her eyes, he said he didn't recognize her anymore. He told police that she yelled at him to stay back and not come any closer, with a clownish tone of voice. JT then turned the knife on him, cutting his arm. JT then ran to the park to meet her friend like she planned, covered in blood. The girls walked the railroad until early morning when they knocked on the door of an older man asking for food. The man called the police and the girls were arrested. Online searches from JT's computer showed her looking at things like how to hide from the police, how to make poison, how to sharpen knives, how to survive in the woods, a video of somebody being stabbed, and a video of Pop Goes the Weasel, as well as many Laughing Jack stories. Obviously, Laughing Jack is a fictional character, but to JT, he was very real because of her history of mental illness. While at LaRue Carter Psychiatric Facility, she is reported to have seen shadows and even went as far as booby-trapping her room. It was then she was determined incompetent to stand trial. Several doctors have diagnosed her with having PTSD and dissociative disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Her family has tried to get her help from several different mental facilities, but 16 of them outright refused her. JT's public defendant, Holly Curtis, said, "This little girl has been failed by everyone. The risk level for her is beyond anything I think anybody can imagine. For her not to be able to get the help she is crying out for is probably one of the biggest travesties I have seen so far, with state agencies not willing to step up and do their job." The state of Indiana was ordered to find her a mental hospital to get her the proper treatment. Although the age of this girl, as well as the Slenderman stabbers, is shocking, their stories are not unique, according to the Treatment Advocacy Center. At least 20% of inmates in correctional facilities in the United States are diagnosed with some sort of serious mental illness. These facilities do what they can to help these inmates and assure they receive proper medications. Living in a prison rather than a hospital equipped to provide proper treatment is often endangers both inmate and others working and living in the facilities.